Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
We begin with my friend Bill Antholis. Bill is the president and the chief executive officer at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. The brand new website, which we were just looking at, it's been redesigned, and it is really something, is millercenter.org. And I cannot recommend it highly enough that you go there and visit. There is so much to see and learn. That's been a project since you started, Bill, right? That's one of the first things you decided to do. Hey, I think we need to revisit our website. And you've been rolling that out. It really, I was just telling you before we went on the air, it looks so good. I think websites are like shrimp. It's so easy to do it wrong, to cook it wrong. But it looks so good. It's not that the old site was bad. It was just, it looks so good now. It really looks great.
Well, thank you, Coy. It's been a labor of love. I've been at the Miller Center now almost 3 years. When I first arrived, we started in early 2015, started working on a project that we call First Year, which was trying to comb our materials, the oral histories that we've done with every president since Gerald Ford, the presidential recordings where we've been transcribing the secret Oval Office tapes of Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and this part of our website where we have biographical essays on all of the presidents written by some of the leading scholars and writers in the country. So unlike Wikipedia, where you have no idea who's written a piece, right. You've got an established scholar, but writing for an accessible audience. And what we were doing in the First Year project was combing the lessons of presidential history. All up until that point, 44 presidents, what have their first years been like? And then our particular materials that we have, these oral histories where we've interviewed the 100 senior-most people and the 4,000 hours of secret Oval Office recordings that we've been trying to transcribe and trying to glean what the lessons of first years were. So we actually launched first a new website promoting that project, firstyear2017.org. And based on that, we knew we wanted to redesign our website, but trying to think, okay, what can we take from this one distinct project that we learned before we do an overhaul of a project that has 25,000 unique pages? What could we learn from a more discrete project where we were starting with what our audiences want and need? And then how do we incorporate video and audio and transcription and biography into that, plus the things that the people who come to our events need, event postings, event summaries, transcripts, trying to put that all into one space, because our website sometimes feels like a newspaper, sometimes it feels like a magazine, sometimes it feels like a TV station or radio station's website. Sometimes it's an archive.
All of which speaks to the real variety of work that you do at the Miller Center.
Exactly. And also to make it attractive. So you'll see beautiful photography is featured, interesting artwork, and a new kind of branding that's consistent in part of UVA's branding, which is fresh and alive. So it's been a lot of fun. So we launched the website earlier this year. And as we were just scrolling through it, we've added things to it that I knew we were going to add, but I hadn't had a chance myself to go look.
There it is.
And there it is. So, for instance, if you go to the site and the presidency part of the site where there are these biographical essays on each of the presidents, if you go to the more recent presidents like the Bush 41 presidency, embedded in his biographical essay or in the biographical essay around him, about him, on the borders of that, you can then link into hearing his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, talk about what it was like to be Defense Secretary, or James Baker talk about what it was like to be Secretary of State. One of my favorite clips that we discovered in all of this work is a terrific clip of Dick Cheney, who many on the left, I think of as one of the more sort of cynical and cold members of the Bush administration, the decisions to go to war in Iraq. And he's talking in a very candid, self-effacing way about the first crisis that the first Bush presidency faced. One of the first national security crises was in October. Here we are in October of President Trump's first year. In October, I think right around the time of October 1st or 2nd of President Bush's first year, there was a failed coup in Panama. And Vice President Cheney says, look, we were a dream team on national security. The President of the United States had been vice president for 8 years, had been ambassador to China, ambassador to the United Nations, director of the CIA. Secretary of State James Baker had already been Secretary of Treasury and White House Chief of Staff. Dick Cheney had already been White House Chief of Staff for Jerry Ford and had been a senior member of Congress. Brent Scowcroft had already been National Security Advisor once. We used to tease him, we're going to make you keep doing this job again until you get it right. Colin Powell was the 4-star general who had just become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we are presented with a crisis, and we totally screwed it up.
Despite all that experience, all that institutional memory.
Because we had never worked together as a team. Baker's off giving a speech at Gettysburg. I'm off doing something else. Powell's just new in the job. Scowcroft, I don't know where the heck he was.
What a huge lesson there.
Yeah.
For any company, any organization.
And what he says is there is no on-the-job training for the most important job in the world, which is working on the national security for the President of the United States. And sure enough, when Bush 43 comes into office, many of those same people are there in the weeks leading up to 9/11. Great experience, but they've never worked together as a team. And we've seen a lot of that in the Trump first year. Who's on first, what's on second, I don't know, on third. That's typical for any organization, even if you've got experienced people. Once you change the team, people aren't used to playing the positions that they're in, and there's an adjustment period in the best of circumstances.
And that's a real challenge for a democracy, where you're always changing the team, right?
Yeah, and our democracy is particularly well-positioned that way, but challenged that way. We're well-positioned because much deeper than most other democratic governments, we replace a new team to express the will of the people. So we have political appointees that reach deep down into the executive branch agencies at a much deeper level than is the case in France or Germany or Britain. When a new parliamentary government comes into one of those places, the governing agencies, the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry, the Treasury Ministry, they have one or two political appointees at the very top. Not every bureau gets a new political appointee. And the new government tends to come in with a coordinated group of people because they have been in opposition. So we have the challenge of both deeper democratic responsiveness because we're inserting Schedule Cs, as they're known, political appointees deep into the administrative structure. Yet the people at the top have not necessarily worked with one another. They tend to not be named until after the election, whereas in a parliamentary system, there's a shadow cabinet that's ready to go on day one. So it's an interesting difference that we have with other governments. And the first year are always great moments of democratic opportunity because you have a new team, but also potentially chaos when you have a new team.
Which has been the criticism of the Trump administration in particular, and partly due to the lack of appointments in the very structure that you're talking about.
Yeah, we've been tracking.
Rick Sincere, who comes in here every week at 5, he follows the State Department very, very closely. And he says they're still waiting on all of these assistant secretary of this, a deputy secretary of that. They're just jobs that are sitting empty because the Trump administration has yet to appoint so many of these key people that make all those departments and organizations run.
We've been tracking that across what we think of as the 5 most important agencies, and Homeland Security is a recent addition. But over the last 6 presidencies, you really want to staff up the State Department, the Defense Department, the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, and Health and Human Services in case there's a crisis of any kind. And most administrations get the cabinet secretaries within the first 5 weeks. Usually there's one or two that get a confirmation challenge, and every administration has one. Bill Clinton had Justice, the Attorney General. He had the nanny gate that befell a few nominees. Bush 41, Dick Cheney was his second choice. John Tower was his first choice. He didn't get confirmed, so they had to come back and get Cheney. For the most part, you get the first 4 or 5 in the first month. And then by the 100th day, we always think about what legislation gets done. You usually get the deputies in those 5 agencies. The Trump administration got the first 5 within the first 5 or 6 weeks. They were a little bit slower in 1 or 2, but they were pretty much on track. When it comes to the deputies, right now, they only have 3 of the 5 deputies. There are still 2 deputies positions.
And it's October.
That are unfilled. And it's October. So the big challenge for an administration is, as that year goes along and as crises come, whether it's North Korea or a domestic crisis like what happened in Nevada last night, you don't have people that know and understand the president's mind deep into the agencies. Now, the career people are all very good. But what they don't know is, what does the political will and moment call for in a situation?
So you get a lot of well-informed, experienced people,
but you get
who are
drift.
afraid to do anything.
Exactly.
Because, I don't want to be out of a job tomorrow. I don't want to pull the trigger on that. Sorry for the pun. But I don't want to green light that because, I could be out of a job tomorrow if the new boss doesn't like what I did.
Absolutely. And that's the challenge. On 9/11 in the Bush 43 administration, they had a slow transition because of the hanging chads in Florida. So we didn't know who the president of the United States was going to be until December 12th, as opposed to November 7th or 8th or whatever the election day was. So they were already over a month behind. They knew who a lot of their people would be. They started confirming people, but by 9/11, so we're past 9/11 in this administration now, but by 9/11, they had only confirmed and appointed about half of the assistant secretaries in those key cabinet agencies that I mentioned. And then they've got this true crisis with 3,000 dead Americans and potentially a war footing in 1 or 2 places. And it was still unclear who within the agencies was both carrying out the president's will, but also who was filtering the information coming up from the agencies and presenting decisions to the president that he might act on. And this administration's far behind that.
And they lost Price. He's undermining his own Secretary of State on Twitter. So even the key people that he has appointed, he loses them, shows that he can't work with them, demonstrates quite publicly that he doesn't necessarily want to work with them or doesn't believe in what they're doing. It's been said in the media over the last 24 hours about Trump that he can truly be his own worst enemy, and get in his own way.
In a few of the agencies, they've done a good job. The Defense Department, because General Mattis just got very focused on it, and he insisted on appointing his own people and pushed people through. And they appear to be, relatively speaking, well-staffed, even if they don't have everybody down at the assistant secretary level. Homeland Security, I think General Kelly, when he was still running, it was very focused on getting the appointment process moving and running. The Justice Department, ironically enough, thankfully they have had a deputy in place. They've worked on a number of different appointments throughout. But a few of these other agencies are really quite thin. And in a few agencies, when you go in with a disruptive mentality, which Secretary Tillerson went into, not a truly disruptive one, not I don't believe in the agency, but I do want to make systemic changes, and I'm not willing to appoint people until I know and understand the changes that I want to make. Now you've got an empty State Department. So if you get multiple diplomatic crises, it's unclear whether our diplomats in the field, whether the acting assistant secretaries, it's unclear whether they're speaking on behalf of the president. Will the president have their back if they're negotiating an issue on the ground?
Yeah. My guest is Bill Antholis. He is the president and the chief executive officer at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. The website is millercenter.org, and you can follow Bill on Twitter as well. Let me change gears really quick here. You said something at the beginning of our conversation when you were talking about the website, where you were you made the point that we really listen to the people who use the website, who actively use the resources that our scholarship provides and that our team works on every single day. Can you take that and sort of pull the camera back and talk a bit about what do citizens need in a democracy? Because it seems to me that here in the first part of the 21st century, that would be something that we would, any of us who work in education or, heck, as citizens, that we need to really give a lot of thought to what do citizens need today? There was the 18th century ideal that public education, the Jefferson-Madison model, and UVA was a part of that. Public education, freed from the chains of, as he would say, monkish ignorance and superstition, controlled by politics or religious faith, public education, a free press, free from the same restraints, that these would serve to educate, I guess in the 18th century model, the key members of a citizenry. We have since then expanded what we mean by citizen and who we're talking about. The very idea of the public has changed since the 18th century. But has that recipe for what that new public needs, has that changed as well? Were they wrong or right that a good public education and a free press would be enough to help citizens preserve their own liberty? And not just preserve it, but grow it.
Well, to the last question, were they right? A free press and our public education is the worst in the world except for all the rest.
You mean in America today?
Yeah, in America. I mean, you sort of, you can't live with it, but you can't live without it either. I think to the role that we see our website playing, who we see as our prime audiences, we come at a bottom up and top down. So in terms of educating our citizenry, we are based at the premier public university in the country, one founded not just by one president, but by three presidents. So the most viewers to our website every year are we think about 5 million undergraduates and perhaps advanced high school students who are doing research on the presidency. We know that because of the peak cycle being in the academic school year. Once you get past mid-May, it starts falling off pretty dramatically. Right. We got a lot of people late at night on a Sunday night surfing the website as we're guessing the writing term papers.
And there's a very conscious
on
decision on the part of you and your team that we need to respond to these people who are trying to get information as citizens of a democracy,
right.
Not just as students of a school.
Exactly. If you Google a president on Wikipedia, or if you Google a president, you'll see the Wikipedia entry. We don't really know who wrote that. So we set out ourselves to provide an accessible, authoritative guide to all of the presidents. So you can get that on our website. That's really terrific stuff, and it's written by some of the leading scholars and authors in the country on the presidency. A few journalists in there, but really high-quality ones, fact-checked, authoritative. That's an important audience for us and for the country. We want people to know presidential history because it's the lens through which, it's not the only lens, it may not be the most important lens, but it is a lens through which people understand American political history, the role of presidents.
And the ideas and ideals that have animated those politics through the years.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that wonderful twinning of words was actually the theme of a lecture that starts moving in our other audience, a lecture that was at the center about a week or so ago by a woman named Melody Barnes. Now, Melody Barnes gave a lecture on the ideas and ideals of American citizenship as seen through the eyes of 4 presidents, and on a very basic idea and ideal that all men, and now women, are created equal. And she traced the evolution of thinking for George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Lyndon Johnson on what did America owe to and what role and responsibilities could America give to African Americans. And what she watched is how those 3 presidents evolved in their thinking on that topic, and essentially evolved. None of them started out as people who simply believed that all men were created equal despite their skin color. And they all evolved in that direction and ended up leading in that direction, even if they didn't go as far as many would like. She traces the arc of justice bending forward. in a really beautiful, coherent way. So going back to our audiences, our website is a space where you would be able to find that lecture, the video from that lecture, and eventually the transcript from that lecture. And there we move from basic students about those presidents, although it will be linked on those presidencies, but to more advanced citizens and policymakers and the media to provide context for today's pressing issues.
To help the teachers teach, to help the educators educate, to help the journalists inform, all of that.
Exactly. And so we see ourselves as the go-to resource on the presidency for, let's call them advanced citizens, not senior citizens, but advanced citizens. Right. People who are thought leaders in the country on the presidency, we want them to come to us, not just as a resource, but to be part of our conversation. So the kinds of people you'll see on our website are the people we bring in to interview on the presidency as an institution, particularly as a part of our Constitution, the president and public policy, and the president and the American people. We're beginning a new undertaking, the successor of the first-year project we're calling Presidency at the Crossroads. And in each of those dimensions, we think once again, as in other epical moments in American history, whether it's the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II, civil rights and Vietnam era, we think in all three of those dimensions, the presidency is at a crossroads. It's undergoing significant change in the Constitution in its relationship with the Congress. On public policy, the president is acting with executive power more, both in war-making and foreign policy and in domestic policy, and with the American people, as we saw here in Charlottesville or in the president's response to hurricanes or Las Vegas. The president speaks for the American people when he doesn't get it right, or eventually when she doesn't get it right. People react. When they do get it right, it helps foster healing and coming together. And so we track those conversations as well.
Trump's reaction to Las Vegas, certainly different from his initial reaction to Charlottesville.
He had a script.
Yes, he did.
It was clearly and convincingly delivered. He sought to speak for all American people. And he has stuck to the script. And as somebody that honed his craft in television, he can be a very effective communicator that potentially can bring Americans together. I think he did well in the first two hurricanes in that regard. And in the third hurricane, not so much. Whether or not you agree or disagree with him, he hasn't had a uniformly positive reaction to that. So hopefully in the Las Vegas incident, he will stick to that.
Yeah. Bill, I know I got to get you out of here. You've got another meeting to get to, and I really appreciate your time. But before I let you go, I did want to give you an opportunity just to share your thoughts about the key takeaways from what happened in Charlottesville in August. And I know that your longer essay can be found at the Miller Center website, but take a moment just to share your thoughts as somebody who works in these issues of public engagement and citizenship and democracy, but also as a longtime neighbor, a resident of Charlottesville, a resident of downtown Charlottesville, just a couple of blocks from where all this happened.
Yeah, so I live on the street, one of the streets that borders the Lee statue and Emancipation Park. I've walked by that statue, over almost 20 years, hundreds, maybe thousands of times. I've also been somebody from both my time at the White House and since then in the world of think tanks and research organizations. I've probably been to a dozen major rallies, that is, rallies that made the front page of a newspaper, rallies that often ended up in tear gas. I've been tear gassed more times than I'd like to try to count. I had been at the Klan rally in July, which had about 40 or 50 Klansmen and about, I didn't ever get an authoritative count, I would say at least
It's what,
at least
2,500?
1,000, probably above 2,000 counter-protesters, demonstrators. I have seen anarchists and hard left protesters upset rallies. I was in Seattle in 1999 when the World Trade Organization exploded into
lots of violence,
tear gas violence, window storms. I think that there are, without questions, violent-prone people across the political spectrum. But I never have ever seen anything like our rally. It was not as big as many that I've been to. In fact, it was still rather small, probably, less than a couple thousand people, maybe 3,000 people. Total max, I don't know. It's hard to count. But I have never seen the open brandishing of that many firearms. And again, probably about 24 by my count and my family's count of right-wing militia, at least 4 or 5 left-wing militia. And I didn't originally know that that was the case. My daughters, who were in their teens, were the ones that spotted that. They were around Court Square, and they were ostensibly in defense of some of the anti-Nazi protesters. It was the combination of the firearms and the vehemence of this army and I don't know what alt-right is, but I know what a Nazi is and I know what a Klansman is. And there were both that were there, and there were a lot of them. They would come up our street in those white vans. My wife and I still say we have PTSD every time we see one of those white, new sort of boxy Chevy vans go by. We saw van after van going by with people with the helmets and the sticks and the shields, and then we saw the guns. And since this morning when I woke up and read about Vegas, it just reinforced with me a feeling that I had and I wrote about, which is we were lucky. We were one mace can away from a mass shooting in downtown Charlottesville. That was my feeling walking around on the streets that day.
And I think the governor would agree with you, because his initial reaction afterwards was, whew, you could almost hear him wiping his brow saying, okay, because that's what they were most concerned about.
We had loss of life that still chills me. My daughter scoops ice cream on the downtown mall at one of the places very close to 4th Street. And I was there at the store with her that day when just a few storefronts down, the car that drove over Heather Heyer, raced by. I saw the street explode in then sort of fist fight violence, Main Street, downtown, the Brickton Mall. We were painfully close to it, and it was, it still is, I think, a searing memory for all of us. And it's not our town. That's not who we are as a people. But it does say for me that the introduction of both hate and firearms in a small, confined space is something that we have to really rethink. And those of us that were opposing those on the right, whether you're left, right, or center, I think do have to also then think about, without saying that there's moral equivalence on that day, the role that more militant protesters on the left bring to these things. Are they going to be tolerant of other views? Going back to the Klan rally in July, there were what I still call anarchist protesters on the front line. Maybe they're Antifa. I don't know. They don't self-identify, or they didn't that day. But they turned to my daughter. They were chanting at the cops. The cops and the Klan go hand in hand. And my daughter, who's 15, challenged them.
That was the chant?
That was the chant of the anarchists at the front lines opposing the Klan. And my 15-year-old daughter challenged them, saying, these cops are here to protect us and to protect your right to free speech. And they challenged her in ways that I can't say over the radio. So for those on the left, and again, this is not who started it on August 11th and 12th. We know that it was the Klan and the Nazis that started it. And the Klan and the Nazi overwhelmingly brought hate and violence and arms to the equation. But people on the left have to be mindful that there's an anarchist fringe that tends to disrupt rallies in favor of progressive causes. And we have to understand what our relationship to as somebody that served in a Democratic administration. I have to have a better grip on what I understand our relationship to those people to be and how we oppose their intolerance. And worse than their intolerance, their own the dimensions of hate that they will occasionally bring to these conversations.
It's almost like the left needs that 1964 Goldwater moment where Goldwater told, the Birch Societies, the Birchers, and told that what would become the alt-right, the white nationalists. He told those guys, no, I'm not letting you in. And Buckley, and they told him, no, you cannot join us. You don't represent us, and we don't want you marching with us.
And I should say, I don't consider Black Lives Matter anywhere close to that sort of hateful intolerance that I'm talking about here. I think that They have raised very important issues about where police justice is and how it relates to African Americans. From my witnessing of both of these rallies, the Black Lives Matter people were, for the most part, incredibly peaceful. I think fights did break out. I didn't see enough of them to know who started them. But there's a distinction between what they are trying to do and those who are going in looking for a fight.
And that's really what it gets down to, right? It gets down to right, left, up, down, middle. If you go to these rallies with the goal to get into a fight, I don't care what your politics are. They do come from the right and the left. And again, it's not a moral equivalency. It's about, what are you after here? What's your goal here?
Richard, two things about it. One is that I think the organizers of the Unite the Right rally knew this.
Absolutely.
They knew that people were coming out, and they were calling for the fight.
Yeah.
The more time we spend talking about that, the less time we're spending talking about how do we advance economic opportunity for all Americans? How do you advance education and social mobility and social justice for people that are not having access to those things? How do we have more civil discourse in the United States? How do we elevate our thinking? And, how do we have a political system that promotes people from both parties that are willing to work across party lines? That's where we think the conversation should be going. And the more time we spend talking about, they're more like British soccer hooligans, except they come armed now. With mace and tear gas and
with that same sense
guns.
of my team versus your team.
Yeah.
And looking to fight.
Yeah, exactly.
Bill Antholis is the president and the chief executive officer at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. The website is millercenter.org, and you can also check out firstyear2017.org and follow Bill on Twitter as well. Thank you, sir, so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Coy. It's great to be here.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.